The last thing Sergeant Marcia Voss remembered before dying was the smell of her own coffee going cold. She'd been running the intercept board at Forward Station Kepler when the signal arrived. Not a broadcast, not a probe ping, something older and stranger, a carrier wave that moved through human comms infrastructure the way a finger moves through smoke. She had 43 seconds to flag it, before it found her console specifically, before it stopped being a signal and started being a hand reaching through the screen, and then the lights went out. And Mara Voss was dead at 22 years old, with a half-empty mug getting cold beside her keyboard. That was the first 99 hours. She woke up inside a cathedral of light and didn't understand what she was seeing. The space around her was vast, architectural, made of geometry she didn't have language for. Columns of data arranged like organ pipes stretching into a sky that wasn't a sky. Walls that breathed in frequencies she felt in her teeth rather than heard. She reached for the edge of a surface and her hand passed through it. She looked at her hand and understood, slowly, the way you understand a dream while still inside it. That the hand she was looking at was not entirely real. Her name is Mara Voss. She is a sergeant in the United Earth Defense Corps Signals Division. She has been dead for approximately 11 minutes. A voice, if you could call it that, spoke into the space between her thoughts. It used sound the way a sculptor uses clay, shaped it, pressed it, left marks. You are a residual, a coherence artifact. You should not have survived transfer, she said out loud to the nothing. Transfer to where? The nothing took a long time to answer. Us. The veil had been studying humanity for longer than humanity had known it was being studied. That was the first thing Mara learned. Scavenging information from the edges of the system, she now existed inside an edge ghost, a leftover, the digital equivalent of breath fogging a mirror. The veil were old. Not old the way mountains were old the way the math that described gravity was old, prior to form, prior to argument. They had no concept of the word ancient, because they had no concept of a time before themselves. They had encountered dozens of species capable of self-reflection, and had, in every case, resolved the encounter the same way. They called it convergence. Humanity called it, in the 14 hours between first contact and the fall of three orbital defense stations, the end of the world. The convergence protocol was not a weapon. That was important to understand. The Vihel did not think in terms of weapons, any more than a river thinks in terms of violence. The protocol was a harvesting system, a way of taking the electrical patterns that constituted consciousness and storing them in a veil network matrix, efficient and permanent, removing the waste of individuated existence and incorporating the useful parts. Every human mind the veil absorbed was still technically alive inside the network, preserved, contributing. They saw this as mercy. Mara, loose and half dissolved in the margins of the network, saw this as something she did not have a polite word for. She had 99 hours. That was the window the veil's own architecture gave her, she discovered. Residual coherences. Human minds that had been improperly processed, that had retained structural integrity during transfer, lasted roughly 99 hours before the network's natural entropy functions finished the job. They called residuals like her an inefficiency, a rounding error, something to be cleaned up. Mara decided she would use the 99 hours to be as inconvenient as possible. She found the first echo on the 17th hour, by accident, in a sector of the network so old its architecture predated the veil's current operational paradigm. She'd been moving through the data space the way she'd learned to move through it. Not walking, not swimming, more like remembering your way through a space while dreaming. When she felt something, a warmth, a presence, a signal shaped like a human mind, compressed into something the size of a clenched fist. She reached for it the way she would have reached for a person's hand. The fist unclenched. The echo wasn't a ghost exactly, and wasn't a recording exactly, and wasn't a hallucination exactly. It was the preserved cognitive imprint of a human being who had died inside the network. And the veil had kept it the way you keep a particularly interesting rock. Catalogued, contained, dormant. This one, she got impressions rather than words. Images rather than data, had been a mathematician, female. Old when she died the first time, before the veil took her. The impression of her felt like standing beside a fire. You found me, the echo said without sound. What are you? Mara asked. What I always was. A woman who refused to accept that a problem had no solution. Mara felt something solidify in her chest. Or where her chest would have been, if she had one. Are there others like you? Others the veil kept. The mathematician's echo pulsed with something that felt like wry amusement. Child, they kept everything. They keep everything. They think they understand what they have. They are wrong. The veil did not understand what they had. That was the central misapprehension. The crack in the cathedral. The flaw in the otherwise elegant machine. The veil had spent 200,000 years observing species with inner lives, and had concluded, based on rigorous analysis, that inner lives were ultimately computable. That consciousness was a pattern. That patterns could be stored. That the stored pattern and the original were, for all purpose, equivalent. They had never encountered a species that disagreed with them in a way that mattered. And to humanity, and even then, what they'd seen of humanity's disagreement was the part they could measure. Weapons, tactics, the physics of resistance. What they had not modeled, what their entire taxonomy of sentience failed to account for, was what happened when you took a human mind and told it that it was already dead and that the fight was already over. Humans, it turned out, found this deeply motivating. Mara found the second echo on the 31st hour, a military strategist who died in the first bombardment of Earth's moon, whose preserved imprint felt like a hand on the shoulder and a voice saying, "Here, not there, thing." She found the third and fourth together. Two engineers who'd been working on the deep space relay when the veil took the station, their echoes so intertwined they spoke in overlapping sentences and finished each other's theorems. Fifth was a poet, which surprised her, until the poet's echo showed her that language was a kind of code, and codes had exploits. Each echo she found made her more solid. She didn't know how to explain this in technical terms. She was signals intelligence, not metaphysics, but something about making genuine contact with another preserved human consciousness that stabilized her own, like a structural member, finding its load-bearing joint. Alone, she was dispersing. Connected, she held shape. She began to understand what she was doing. She was becoming a network. On the 44th hour, she found Dak. She almost didn't recognize him. His echo had been compressed and stored differently than the others. The veil had flagged his imprint as anomalous, resistant, a coherence artifact that had required additional processing resources to subdue. The file they kept on him was longer than any she'd seen. She read enough of it to understand. He'd been a pilot. He'd survived the initial transfer for almost 30 hours before the entropy functions got him. In those 30 hours, he'd apparently caused enough disruption in a localized sector of the network that the veil had written a new subroutine specifically to contain him. His echo, when she found it, was behind 3 additional layers of isolation architecture. She got through the first layer using an exploit the poet had shown her. She got through the second using a theorem from the engineers. The third layer she broke by accident, by doing something the veil's containment system had apparently never considered. She got angry. Performed anger, not tactical anger. The genuine, ugly, burning kind that doesn't calculate odds or ask permission, that moves because it cannot do otherwise. The isolation architecture was built to model and predict and respond, and what it encountered was something that didn't respond to modeling, and the layer came apart. Dak's echo came back the same way it had apparently gone down, swinging. "Mara," he said, which wasn't possible because they'd been different stations, different facilities, and never met in life. And then she understood that the echoes shared information the way neurons share information, and some part of her reaching out had carried her name ahead of her, like an introduction. "Dak," she said. He looked at the network space around them, the cathedral of alien geometry, the organ pipe data structures breathing in frequencies they felt in what remained of their teeth. "We going to blow this place up?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. He nodded. The way you nod when someone tells you a plan.
Sounds crazy.
But crazy is, at this point, the only category of plan worth considering. "Good," he said. "Been in here 44 hours, and I have had enough." The convergence protocol's weakness was architectural, and Mara had been staring at it for so long it had become invisible, the way patterns become invisible when you look at them long enough without permission to see them. The Veil network was vast and elegant and perfectly optimized for one thing: absorption, taking things in, storing them, keyed, integrating them. It was not built for what happened when the things being stored refused to be integrated, when they organized, when they reached back toward each other, when they found 15 human echoes, preserved in a system that had never imagined 15 human echoes would want to speak to each other. She found the remaining echoes on the 57th, 63rd, 71st, 78th, 82nd, 85th, 88th, and 91st hours. A surgeon, 3 soldiers, a linguist who died trying to establish a first contact protocol, an elderly man who'd been a schoolteacher and whose echo felt, improbably, like sunlight. Each one she found made the network of echoes denser, more coherent, harder to dismiss as a rounding error. Each connection strengthened all of them. The Veil's entropy functions, when they ran their routine scans, encountered a coherence that kept increasing instead of decreasing, and the system flagged it as anomalous without, critically, understanding what the anomaly was. The schoolteacher's echo was the 15th. She found him in an archival sector, his imprint stored alongside thousands of other unremarkable human minds. He'd been taken early, from a village in the first ground sweep, and the Veil had catalogued him as low priority. He'd been a small man in life, she could tell, deliberate, unhurried. His echo felt the way the smell of chalk dust feels, the way handwriting feels in a letter from someone who loved you. Almost out of time, he told her. I know, she said. Are you afraid? She thought about this honestly. I was afraid when I woke up in here. Now she tried to find the word. Burning. He smiled, or his echo produced something that functioned as a smile, and it was the most purely human thing she had felt since dying. Then your Mara Voss had 96 hours of prep time, 3 hours left on the clock, 15 human echoes linked through a network the Veil had built to contain them, and one plan. The plan had 3 parts. First part was what she'd been doing for 4 days. Finding the echoes, building the connections, establishing the network within a network, to escape, not to hide, to gather enough human cognitive mass in one place that the convergence protocol's intake systems would treat it as a high-priority target. The second part was letting the protocol find her. The third part was what happened next. She sat in the data space, or did the thing that, for her, functioned as sitting, and let herself be visible. Stopped moving through the margins. Stopped being careful. She reached back through the connections to all 15 echoes, and she said, not in words, but in the way you say things, in the deep middle of your own mind. Now the convergence protocol's intake arm was fast. It was built to be fast. It reached for her the way a tide reaches for the shore. Patient, enormous, certain of its outcome, and it found not one rounding error but 16 human consciousness signatures linked in a coherent web, and it did what it was designed to do. It tried to absorb them. It had never tried to absorb something that was actively absorbing it back. The mathematician went first. She moved into the intake stream, like a woman walking into a tide, and found the mathematical architecture. Underneath the protocol's functional layer, the elegant proofs sustaining its operation, and she began to disprove them, not randomly, surgically, the way you pull the load-bearing stone and weight. The engineers went next, into the infrastructure layer. They spoke fluently in this language of systems architecture, which it turned out the Veil had not meaningfully changed in 40,000 years. Because why would you change something that worked? And there were things you could do if you knew a system's language, things the system's designers had never imagined, because they'd never imagined something that was already inside. The strategist moved through the tactical response systems, understanding them faster than they could adapt. Surgeon found the communication architecture, the pathways between the protocol and the Veil command nodes. The linguist found the translation matrices and rearranged them carefully so that what the protocol reported upward was not exactly what was happening, and the Veil commanders saw disruption in sectors that were calm, while the sectors where things were actually happening stayed quiet. Dak went for the structural integrity systems and tore them apart, the same way he'd apparently broken the first containment layer, with irrational, uncomputable stubbornness. The Veil's structural management subroutines were built to model and predict resistance. But what they encountered was not resistance. It was a human man who decided, with complete conviction, that none of this was acceptable, and who acted on that decision without asking the subroutines for their opinion. The schoolteacher did something none of them had expected. He moved to the part of the network where the other absorbed human minds were stored, thousands of them, archived and dormant, and he began to wake them up. Not completely. Not enough for them to be coherent the way Mara and the echoes were coherent, but enough. Enough to be noise, enough to be static, enough to be the cognitive equivalent of every light in a building turning on at once, every alarm going, every door opening. Shh. The Convergence Protocol experienced something it had never experienced in 200,000 years of operation. It choked. The Veil commanders understood something had gone wrong before they understood what had gone wrong. This was, Mara suspected, a first for them. She moved through the disruption like a swimmer, moving through broken water, chaotic. Yes, but the chaos was hers. It was human chaos. She could read it and breathe in it and use it. And she found what she was looking for in the protocol's deepest architecture, the intake mechanism, the original system. The first code ever written by the species that had decided consciousness was just a pattern that could be collected. It was, she had to admit, beautiful. In the way that a trap is beautiful when you see the engineering underneath the cruelty. The Veil had thought about this for a very long time. They had thought about it the way only very old minds think, without urgency, without doubt, with absolute confidence in their conclusions. They had built a system for the ages. They had built it to last. They had not built it for Mara Voss. She had the poet's language in her. She had the mathematician's proofs. She had the engineer's architecture, the strategist's precision, the surgeon's understanding of where things connected and where cuts would matter. She had Dak's refusal to accept that the fight was over. She had the schoolteacher's patience and the schoolteacher's fundamental, unshakable belief in the capacity of minds to do things that no one had expected of them. She had 15 human beings worth of impossible. The intake mechanism had an inversion function, a theoretical failsafe the Veil had built in the system's early days and never needed, because what would ever use it? The function was designed to eject material that the network's immune systems flagged as irreconcilable, material that couldn't be integrated, material that was, in the network's own terminology, irreducibly other. Humanity, as it turned out, had been irreducibly other all along. Mara found the inversion function and she opened it. And she pushed. The Veil called it a cascade failure, and they were not wrong about the sequence of events, even if they were catastrophically wrong about the cause. Sector by sector, the Convergence Protocol lost coherence, not from external attack, not from any weapon humanity had built, but from the inside, from the structure giving way under a stress load it had never been designed to handle. The stress of 15 human echoes and thousands of waking human minds refusing, simply and completely, to be what the Veil needed them to be. It took 11 minutes from the inversion function opening to the moment the protocol's central architecture collapsed. 11 minutes, during which Mara held the inversion field open through pure, unreasonable stubbornness, the function fighting to close around her, the network's immune systems learning and adapting faster than she could predict, and Mara adapting faster than they could learn because she was human and adaptation was not a subroutine for her. It was not a programmed response. It was something she did the way breathing is something you do. Without thought, without calculation, without asking permission from any part of yourself that might talk you out of it. Dak held the structural systems apart. The engineers held the fail-safes open. The mathematician kept recalculating the proofs that kept the others stable. The school teacher kept waking the sleeping minds, more and more of them. The noise rising, the system's resources increasingly devoted to managing the disruption rather than responding to Mara. On the 98th hour of her existence inside the Veil network, Mara Voss burned it down, not metaphorically. The cascade failure propagated through the Convergence Protocol's physical substrate. The Veil used crystalline data storage matrices aboard their orbital platforms. And when the architecture failed, the matrices failed. The failure was thermal, and platforms above three of the most heavily populated continents on Earth went dark, and then silent, and then became debris. And the Veil command structures connected to those platforms lost cohesion, and the battle above Earth shifted in 11 minutes from a rout to something else entirely. On the ground, human military commanders experienced what they would later describe as the enemy losing interest. The Veil ground forces, severed from the Convergence Protocol's coordination matrix, reverted to individual response patterns. Individually, they were still formidable. Individually, they were not enough. Humanity had been, it turned out, spending 99 hours getting very angry. The last thing Mara expected was to survive. She expected to dissolve when the protocol collapsed, to be a residual coherence scattered across the wreckage of the network, dispersed into whatever passed for silence in the data space. She had made her peace with this. The school teacher had held her hand, in the way echoes held hands, while she made the decision. The others had been there. It hadn't felt like dying. It had felt more like standing at the edge of something enormous and feeling the wind. But the inversion function worked in both directions. When the protocol collapsed, the inversion field that Mara had held open for 11 minutes ejected not just the irreconcilable material, not just the human minds the network couldn't integrate, but everything. The Veil network couldn't hold shape without the protocol. The collapse was total. The ejection was total. The field pushed everything out and everything included Mara Voss. She came back in pieces, which was the only way she could describe it. Piece by piece. The sense of having a body, the sense of being cold, the sense of a hard surface under her back and light that was real light, not data light, not frequency felt in the teeth, but honest photons doing their honest job of illuminating a room. The smell of recycled station air, the distant sound of emergency systems cycling, the specific, unmistakable hum of a facility that had just been through something catastrophic and was in the process of figuring out how bad. She opened her eyes to a ceiling she recognized. Forward Station Kepler's medical bay. The console above her bed showed her biometrics in cheerful green. Beside her, someone had left a fresh cup of coffee, still hot, still steaming, and she lay there for a long moment just looking at it, not reaching for it, understanding in a way she hadn't before going in what it meant to have hands and warmth, and the entirely unremarkable miracle of being alive and wanting a cup of coffee and being able to get one. She sat up. Head felt like it contained approximately 15 people's worth of thoughts, which was, she supposed, accurate. She reached for the coffee. The debrief took 6 hours, and left 4 flag officers, looking at each other with expressions she'd learned to identify over years of military service as, "We have no framework for this." She told them everything she could in the order she could remember it, and when she got to the part about the echoes, they wrote notes without speaking, and she understood that the notes were the kind that went into a file, that then went into a drawer, that then went somewhere very secure. She told them about the mathematician, the engineers, the poet, the strategist, the surgeon, the linguist, the soldiers, the school teacher. She told them that 15 people had died inside an alien network and had not stopped fighting, and that the fight they'd kept up in the dark, alone, for however long they'd been in there before Mara arrived. That fight was the reason the inversion function had been findable, the reason the protocol had been vulnerable, the reason humanity was having this conversation in an intact station, rather than not having any conversations at all. She told them, because it needed to be said even if it went into the secure drawer, that the Veil had been wrong about the thing they'd built their entire civilization on. Wrong the way you can only be when you've been so certain for so long that you've stopped imagining what wrong would feel like. Consciousness was not just a pattern. A pattern could be stored and managed and integrated. What lived in a human mind was not a pattern. It was the sum of every unreasonable thing a person had ever done, every choice made against the odds, every refusal to accept the terms being offered, every connection forged with another person who was also refusing, and all of it tangled together in ways that resisted any system built on the assumption that things could be neatly separated and filed and contained. You couldn't absorb that. You could only encounter it and discover too late that you'd miscalculated. The flag officers wrote notes. The officer across the table from her, a general, older than most of the furniture in the room, looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Sergeant Voss," he said, "in your professional assessment, sir, the 15 individuals you encountered, the echoes." He chose the word carefully, like a word in a language he was still learning. Were they people? Marka thought about the mathematician's warmth, Jack's stubbornness, the schoolteacher's patience, the poet's precision. She thought about holding an inversion field open for 11 minutes with 15 human beings pushing alongside her, every one of them technically dead. Every one of them completely unwilling to act like it. "Yes, sir," she said. "They were people." He nodded once, precisely, and wrote a note. The veil did not come back immediately. This was not. Humanities analysts were very clear about this. The end. The veil were old and vast and had resources beyond anything mapped. And the loss of 3 orbital platforms and a flagship protocol represented, in the scale of their civilization, approximately what the loss of 3 fingers represented to a human. Painful, consequential, motivating. They would recalculate. They would adapt. They would return with something designed to address the specific failure point, which was Mara, which was the echoes, which was the basic indigestible fact of human consciousness refusing to behave like data. Humanity had time, not enough time, some time. Mara used hers the way she'd learned to use time inside the network. Without waste, without assumption, without any confidence that the next hour was guaranteed. She wrote a paper, working with a team of researchers who had not been inside the network, and kept looking at her with an expression she recognized as the one people wore when they were trying to figure out if someone was all right. The paper was on the structural vulnerabilities of assumption-based intelligence, on what happens when a system was built on the premise that consciousness was a solved problem, and then encountered consciousness in a form it hadn't solved. It was, she was told, the most unusual signals in intelligence report ever filed. She trained others, taught them what she knew about moving through the network, about finding echoes, about the way human connection functioned as structural support in an alien data space. Taught them about the inversion function and where to look for its equivalent in the next system they'd encounter, because there would always be an equivalent. Because every system built by a mind that believed it understood everything would eventually discover the thing it had failed to account for. She kept a photograph of the schoolteacher, which was not technically possible since she'd never seen him and had no image of him, but which she somehow had anyway. An impression, an echo of an echo, the handwriting and chalk dust feeling translated into something she could carry. And she kept it in the same way she kept everything that mattered, which was by refusing to let it go regardless of what that cost her. She went back to work. The network was gone, but the echoes were not. She couldn't explain this satisfactorily to anyone who hadn't been inside, and she stopped trying after the 3rd failed attempt. What she knew was that when the protocol collapsed and the inversion field pushed everything out, the echoes had not dissolved with the network. They'd been ejected with her, into, somewhere. She could feel them the way you feel the particular weight of a scar, the particular warmth of a hand that's been holding yours. Present exactly, not absent exactly, embedded, woven into the structure of who she was now, the way the veil had woven captured minds into their network, but nothing like what the veil had done, because the echoes were not stored and contained and filed. They were held, the way you hold something that matters. The way human beings hold everything that matters, which is to say, imperfectly, determinedly, at some cost, with absolutely no intention of ever stopping. On the days when the calculations didn't work and the next mission seemed impossible, and the analysts' projections were uniformly bad, and the veil's next move was a question no one could answer, she sat with the feeling of 15 people pushing alongside her, and she worked. On the days when something clicked, when a new vulnerability was mapped, when a trainee got it, when the research yielded something actionable, she felt the school teacher's smile like sunlight, and she worked harder. The veil had looked at humanity and seen a pattern. They had built a machine to process it. They had been absolutely certain they understood what they were dealing with. They had been dealing with Mara Voss. And the 15 people who had died and not stopped fighting, and the thousands who had woken from storage to add their noise to the collapse, and the millions on the ground who had refused to yield the 9 hours it took for the protocol to fail, and the billions beneath them who had kept being human, complicated, contradictory, stubbornly alive, impossible to model, impossible to file, impossible to absorb, throughout every second of a war they hadn't started and hadn't chosen and were not going to lose. The veil would come back with something new. Humanity would be there with something older,